Future Sight is one of the most common and yet broken abilities in all of anime, and the level of its brokenness really highly depends on just how good the Future Sight is. See, because there's really only three kinds of Future Sight. The I can see the future but can't change what happens type, the I can see all possible futures but can't change what happens type, or the I can see all possible futures and choose which future I want type. And Future Sight in the Boruto universe falls under the second categorization, as Tenpass has now been established as a Shinjutsu that people can get either by taking the cells of Shibai, or presumably just by getting strong enough as an Otsutsuki, and through the power of this ability, the Shinjutsu user, who now has the Tenpass, has the ability to see all future timelines. But just being able to see all future timelines doesn't necessarily mean that you can accomplish one specific timeline. Yes, of course, you can try and guide humanity in the direction of the timeline you want to occur, but getting things to go exactly the way you want them to go isn't always the easiest task. And as it currently stands, this is the task that Kashin Koji is stuck with. But any way I look at it, he's either not doing a good job with this task, or he's purposely misleading those who he's trying to direct in the right direction. See, because a couple of things aren't adding up with the fact that Kashin Koji, who is now effectively Boruto Sensei, has Future Sight. And the most notable of those things is the fact that in all these future timelines that Kashin Koji has seen, none of them include Boruto being overtaken by his karma marking. And that's suspicious, given how incredibly terrified Boruto is of being taken over by his karma marking. See, one would assume that if Boruto is actively trying to not use his karma marking because he believes the next time he uses his karma marking, he'll be taken over by Momoshiki, wouldn't it stand to reason that in one of the infinite timelines that Kashin Koji has seen, that Boruto was pushed into a situation where he was forced to use his karma marking and therefore Momoshiki took over. Something that would presumably, at least so far as Boruto is concerned, lead to the end of the world. And yet the only ways that we really saw the end of the world coming to pass, at least so far as Kashin Koji laid out for us, is either that Naruto lost after using Baryon mode, or that Kawaki killed Boruto on top of the Hokage heads at the end of part 1. No mention whatsoever of Boruto being overtaken by his karma marking. And to me, and the emailer Daniel Bruno, that seems highly suspicious. But why? Why hasn't Kashin Koji seen this future where Boruto is taken over by Momoshiki and Momoshiki finally consumes the Earth's chakra fruit? Is it because he doesn't want to tell Boruto? Is it because it simply never happens in any of the infinite timelines? Or is it because he can't see that timeline? Ironically, I believe all three of these circumstances hold an equal amount of possibility to each other. And thus today, those three scenarios are exactly what we're going to be talking about. Because today, we're talking Kashin Koji is lying. But before we get to talking about whether or not Kashin Koji is telling the truth, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking at my Super Sick shirt and wondering, damn, I wonder where Nick got that, it's actually from my brand new merch line, where I'm trying to combine my love for streetwear and anime. And you can find the whole line on my brand new Fourth Wall website. The link's in the description. Listen, any way you slice it, it's odd that Kashin Koji isn't as worried about Boruto's karma marking as Boruto is himself. See, over the course of Two Blue Vortex, we've only really interacted with Boruto's karma twice. Once in Chapter 9 when Boruto's karma marking began resonating with Kawaki's, and once again in Chapter 15 when Boruto was explaining why he had to run from the battle against Kawaki, telling him about how he's no longer using his karma because he feels as though the next time he uses it, Momoshiki will break out of him. Now, ironically, the concern for Boruto awakening his karma marking comes from two separate people in these two separate scenarios. In Chapter 9, it's Kashin Koji, who through his toad looks down at Boruto's hands and sees his karma marking beginning to resonate with Kawaki's, and then upon that realization tells Boruto that he needs to put distance between himself and Kawaki because their karma markings are resonating. But in Chapter 15, it's Boruto illustrating why he had to do that in the first place to Kawaki, with no intervention from Kashin Koji. And rather interestingly, in Chapter 15, when Boruto was explaining why he can't use his karma marking, he doesn't bring up Kashin Koji's name ever. He instead tells us about how 2 years ago was the last time he tried to use his karma marking when Code was battling against Sasuke in the time skip, and that when he tried to activate his karma marking in that moment, he felt the same sensation as when Momoshiki takes over his body. Now, this does prove that both Kashin Koji and Boruto are concerned about the karma marking awakening on Boruto, which to some of you might prove, I guess Kashin Koji did tell Boruto about a future where his karma marking takes over his body and he becomes Borushiki and destroys the world. But what we learned in Chapter 15 seemed to illustrate the fact that Boruto was done using his karma marking before he even met Kashin Koji, because it was during Code and Sasuke's fight that he identified the fact that if he used his karma marking again, there was a solid possibility he would lose control forever. There was then a solid-ish amount of time before Boruto was eventually found by Kashin Koji, during which Boruto could have solidified in his own head that he would never use his karma marking again. And thus the concern that Kashin Koji orates when Boruto's karma marking begins to resonate with Kawaki's could simply come from the fact that Boruto told Kashin Koji what happened when he was seeing Code and Sasuke fight. It doesn't necessarily necessarily have to come from the Ten Paths. And if we move forward with the ideology that Kashin Koji knows that Boruto shouldn't use his karma marking because of what Boruto told him, as opposed to what he saw, which would line up with everything that he's told us about the future timelines he's seen using his Shinjutsu, then at that point, things start to get a bit fishy. See, because the two timelines that Kashin Koji told us about that led to the demise of the Earth revolved around Naruto losing after activating his Baryon mode in his battle against Ishiki, and Boruto losing in a fight to Kawaki on top of the stone heads. And even outside of the fact that Kashin Koji didn't decide to tell us about a future where Borushiki takes over and destroys the world, wouldn't it make sense in either of these future scenarios, be it either the Ishiki wins timeline or the Code wins timeline, that Borushiki would have showed up at some point or another? See, because both of these timelines hinge on the fact that Boruto has to lose to either Ishiki or to Kawaki. But Boruto losing in either of these scenarios, and technically in all scenarios, is also a loss for Momoshiki. And since it's been established, whenever Boruto is put in incredibly dangerous and borderline fatal situations, that Momoshiki takes over, enacting Borushiki, wouldn't it make sense that if Boruto is put in a fatal-ish situation by either Ishiki or Kawaki, that Borushiki would have come out to play and possibly clutched up? See, because to me, it seems unlikely that Momoshiki would just let Boruto die, especially when you consider the fact that both of these timelines end in part 1 of Boruto when Momoshiki hadn't been quiet for 3 years. And yet, no mention of Borushiki in either of these future timelines. But things only get more suspicious when you consider the information we've been given in part 2 of Boruto. See, because when Boruto's describing to Kawaki why he no longer uses his karma marking, he doesn't say he could feel Momoshiki taking over his body. He simply says he feels a sensation that feels the same as when Momoshiki used to take over his body, like he was actively dying while still being conscious. And Boruto goes on to say that Momoshiki's been quiet for 3 years, but he's afraid that if he uses his karma marking again, that Momoshiki will re-emerge. But if that's such a big concern of Boruto, why haven't we heard about it in the possible futures? And why is the verbiage surrounding the awakening of the karma marking so intentionally vague, as if to not include Momoshiki in the equation at all? And when it comes down to it, I think there's really only 3 possible ways to explain it. Either Kashin Koji is lying, there are no timelines in which Boruto is overtaken by his karma marking, or Kashin Koji and all 10 Paths users have the inability to see a future where Borushiki takes over the world. And all 3 of these explanations have pros and cons. And I find all 3 of these possibilities equally interesting. And therefore, the only way to tackle these is to do them in the order I just said them. Which means the first explanation we're going to be exploring is that Kashin Koji is lying. But what do we mean by Kashin Koji is lying, and why would he be lying in the first place? Well, I consider an omission of the truth a lie, and I think what Kashin Koji is doing here might be an omission of the truth. But why would Kashin Koji purposely be omitting the truth of other possible future timelines to Boruto? And to that question, I believe the answer lies with Shibai. So we've been talking about for a long time that Boruto seems to be connected to Shibai in one way or another. Whether it be the fact that Borushiki doesn't seem to manifest Momoshiki's horns like Kawaki manifests Ishiki's horns in his karma marking form, or the fact that the one time that we've ever seen Shibai's full body, he was using a jutsu that looked a lot like Rasengan Uzuhiko, or the fact that Boruto was for some reason born with a Jogan, which has only ever been seen used by the likes of Shibai. When it comes down to it, there has seemingly been a lot of purposeful connections made between Boruto and Shibai. When you take that into consideration, alongside the fact that Momoshiki has been dormant inside of Boruto for the last 3 years, then it appears as though something's going kind of haywire with Boruto's karma marking. And that something haywire may not be Momoshiki getting stronger inside of Boruto, but rather it could possibly be Momoshiki getting suppressed inside of Boruto. See, obviously at the end of part 1 of Boruto, Momoshiki was incredibly fervent in his desire to take over Boruto. And this could just be chalked up to the fact that Momoshiki wants to be in control of Boruto, and therefore why wouldn't he fervently wish for it? However, what if Momoshiki trying to break Boruto's will at the end of part 1 wasn't coming from a place of want, but a place of need? See, it's long been theorized that Momoshiki, just like Kashin Koji, also has the 10 Paths, as Momoshiki multiple times ambiguously talked about the futures of either Naruto or Boruto. Like when Momoshiki talked to Naruto and Kurama and talked about how it was a shame that the fox would never have the ability to pass down his powers. Or when he told Boruto that those blue eyes will take everything from you, most likely referencing the fact that Ada has blue eyes and her omnipotence firing would switch his and Kawaki's positions. And therefore, very clearly in both of these scenarios, Momoshiki seemingly was talking about the future of Naruto, Kurama, and Boruto, almost from the perspective of somebody who seemingly knew what was gonna happen. And thus there's a possibility that Momoshiki, with this future sight ability in the 10 Paths, also knew that if he wasn't able to take over Boruto at his lowest point after the firing of omnipotence, that he may never get a chance again. But why would he never get a chance again? Well, The answer is Shibai. See, whether Shibai took interest in Boruto because of his parents, the fact that he was born with the dojutsu that only Shibai was supposed to have, or so many other reasons, what the Boruto manga seems to be getting at here, slowly but surely, is that Shibai is going to come into the fold, and most likely it's going to have something to do with Boruto. And therefore, what if the reason that when Boruto tried to activate his karma marking, the reason it felt as though he was being taken over immediately is because the person controlling his karma marking was much stronger than Momoshiki? What if that was the first sign that an entity far beyond the strength of Momoshiki had taken the reins on Boruto's karma marking? And that is the reason that Momoshiki has gone quiet, and also the reason that Boruto can no longer access the powers of the karma marking without fear of it overtaking him. Something he didn't have to worry about when Momoshiki was the sole owner of said karma marking. But if this is the truth of the matter, and Shibai is slowly but surely making a play for Boruto's body, why would Kashin Koji purposely omit that information from Boruto when telling him about the futures that the 10 paths has illustrated for him? Well, it was very, and I mean very clearly demonstrated to us at the end of part 1 that Boruto keeping his morale high is instrumental to him keeping control of his own body. See, because if Boruto had given into the despair that Momoshiki was trying to get him to give into at the end of part 1, Borushiki would have been around forever. And therefore, if Kashin Koji was to let Boruto know that in half of the possible futures, you access your karma marking and Shibai takes over your body and not only consumes the entirety of the Earth, but also hundreds of other planets, that seems like the kind of information that could possibly dishearten Boruto to the point where he would let somebody like Shibai take over his body. See, because Boruto has already killed Momoshiki. Boruto views Momoshiki as an equal strength opponent. However, if Boruto were to find out that his battle is now with the god of the Otsutsuki, that would change Boruto's idea of how likely success is in the long run of his life. On top of this, I'd like to circle back to the idea of how Boruto learned Rasengan Uzuhiko in the first place. See, once again, like most things surrounding the 10 paths, it was purposely worded incredibly vaguely. Basically, all we were told about how Boruto was able to learn Rasengan Uzuhiko is because he was able to learn it sometime in the future. But what if the reason that Boruto was able to learn Rasengan Uzuhiko wasn't just because one day he became better with the usage of the Rasengan, but rather because in so many timelines he's consumed by Shibai, who uses the Rasengan Uzuhiko. And therefore, Kashin Koji, in a bit of clever maneuvering, decided to take the strongest jutsu used by that version of Shibai in Boruto and teach it to Boruto sans Shibai. I don't know about you, but that makes a fair amount of sense to me. However, if you're one of the people who's always commenting the young lord clears in every video you ever see about Boruto, then the second possibility to explain why Boruto is never taken over in any of the future timelines shown to us by the 10 paths is just that it literally never happens. That is to say that at least in Kashin Koji's prediction of all possible futures, there is one consistent theme, and that consistent theme is that Boruto does not give up. Now, considering the fact that Boruto was placed in the worst ever situation at the end of part 1, and still in that scenario where Momoshiki was entirely sure he was going to give up, possibly because of his 10 paths predictions, and yet Boruto still did not give up, would give some credence to this theory. Boruto being an enigma that defeats the idea of infinite possibilities would be a really sick caveat in the 10 paths ability. This theory does, of course, directly fly in the face of the idea that Momoshiki's 10 paths predictions saw Boruto giving in after the firing of Omnipotence, but 10 paths might work differently for different people. Who's to say? But while I do believe these two possible explanations are fun and definitely do have a lot of pros and cons, I don't think either of them are as fun as our final explanation. The explanation that the Boruto timeline that Boruto exists in is simply unpredictable. And I don't mean unpredictable in the sense of all the craziest things happen in this timeline. I mean unpredictable in the sense as in it is impossible to predict exactly what is going to happen in this Boruto timeline. And out of all of the explanations we've talked about today, this explanation makes the most sense. See, because there has been multiple events that have happened during the course of part 2 of Two Blue Vortex after 10 Paths users have been confirmed that have surprised either 10 Paths users or those adjacent to 10 Path users who should know about the future possibilities of all of these timelines. Now, I'm not talking about the minute details like Kashin Koji being surprised that Boruto's karma marking was resonating with Kawaki's. In the grand scope of an ability that allows you to see infinite timelines, assuming you're not somebody like Yahaba from Bleach, you're not going to be able to identify every little thing that happens. In fact, 10 Paths as an ability seems more focused on how a timeline ends as opposed to the events that led up to that end. That being said, there are still absolutely things that should have been predicted to either 10 Paths users or those adjacent to them that for some reason they seem baffled by. And the best example of this is something that we've already talked about in this video: Boruto battling back against Momoshiki's mental domination. See, because within the confines of the timeline that we exist in Boruto, this means that Momoshiki didn't predict Sarada awakening the MS, Sasuke being shaken out of omnipotence, and Sasuke flying to Boruto's side. All of these events that led to Boruto not falling into dismay. Now, ironically, all three of those people who were involved in the breaking of the timeline that Momoshiki foresaw, presumably, have either directly received Six Paths chakra or come from somebody who has. And this is a consistency. See, because another event that seemed to fall out of the purview of those who have access to the 10 paths was the fact that Himawari awoke as a Jinchuriki of sorts to Kurama, a twist that seemed to confuse not only Kashin Koji, but Boruto. And a twist, while even if it is incredibly unlikely, should have popped up in many timelines. However, once again, Himawari is somebody who's come from somebody who has received Six Paths chakra. And thus there's this consistent trend that the people that tend to break the mold of what the 10 paths futures lay out are those who have received Six Paths chakra in one way or another. And this as an explanation makes a fair amount of sense. See, because it's already been established that baked into the usage of most Shinjutsu is the fact that they don't work against Otsutskis. This is why Omnipotence, when it was being used by Ada, didn't work on Kawaki or Boruto. Now, this seems to only apply to prediction/control type abilities, as Daemon's Reflect and Code's Claw Mark seem to work on Otsutskis. And this is illustrated by the fact that Daemon's Reflect works on Code, and Code's Claw Marks work on the Shinju and Code, and Boruto and Kawaki. But these Shinjutsu are physical in nature, and therefore it would make sense that if any of the Shinjutsu were going to work on other Otsutskis, it would be these. But the Shinjutsu that are involved in prediction and control would make sense if they weren't effective on other Otsutskis. Because if they were effective on other Otsutskis, what would stop one Otsutski who has Omnipotence from wiping out all other Otsutskis? What would stop one Otsutski with the 10 paths from using the 10 paths to dominate all other Otsutskis? For the Otsutskis to retain their autonomy, it would make sense that their most powerful Shinjutsu wouldn't work on each other. And therefore, because Earth has become so inundated with Six Paths chakra through the likes of Hagoromo, it would make sense that those who hold on to vestiges of that chakra or who are full-blooded Otsutskis like Kawaki and Boruto would fall outside of the purview of the 10 paths ability, which could explain why Boruto has been able to keep Earth on the delicate tightrope walk that has kept it alive up until this point. Because Boruto doesn't necessarily have to be constrained by the predictions of the Shinjutsu. And therefore, while this timeline can still be somewhat predictable to those with the 10 paths ability, which is how Momoshiki was able to predict things like Omnipotence being fired, and Kashin Koji was able to predict the awakening of the Shinki Shinju, Ryu. However, in pretty much all regards, every single telling of the future has been wrong about Boruto, Sarada, Kawaki, and all other Six Paths chakra users like Himawari. And therefore, basically what I'm driving at here is the amount of enigmas in this timeline that aren't affected by the 10 paths jutsu make this timeline impossible to predict. Which could be another possible reason that the Otsutsuki are so obsessed with the idea of wiping out Earth, because it doesn't abide by the rules. But then again, who's to say? Maybe Kashin Koji has told Boruto about futures where he's overtaken by the Otsutsuki inside of him and consumes the entire Earth, and he just didn't decide to tell us about it. There's really no way to know until we do. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Out of these three possibilities, which do you find the most intriguing and most likely? Tell me in the comments below. And to why it goes down there, please. For me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Look, there's flames on the side. It's on both sides. And then I drew this. I didn't draw this. It was designed for me. I don't know why I lied.